The cinema. Who invented it? There isn't just one person or group of people. It's a complicated answer, with a lot of smart people from a lot of different places. The success of the cinema is closely related to our infatuation with stories. Our love for lore goes back to the days of cave paintings and hieroglyphics. Tales of heroism and romance worked well on those walls and cemented their legacy to be forever pondered by future generations of posterity. But it wasn't until those pictures began to move that the world would change forever. Although there were many contributors to the world of motion pictures, it was during a critical period in history that a pair of brothers living in France would set in motion an art form that would touch the lives of the world. The business of using pictures to tell stories goes way back in our history. Early depictions of pottery in ancient Egypt seem to tell tales of their own, often showing animals and people doing things. These depictions are often considered to be an ancestor to the hieroglyphic system developed around 3200 BC. Even if you can't describe the specifics, you can see that something happened. The early hieroglyphics were a formalized writing system used to depict the conquest of kings and the glory of victory. They told stories in an almost cinematic way, and the renderings may remind you of a graphic novel, with frames that represent a moment in time. It wasn't just a single image, but the connection and chronology of all the images combined that told the tales that would become legend. Unlike tales around the campfire, these stories were etched in stone and scribed on various types of paper, like papyrus, giving them a life beyond that of the storyteller. A picture, they say, is worth 1,000 words. The display of images would eventually evolve into projection. The magic lantern was an early form of projection that would place a slide in front of a light and project the image on a wall. Before electricity, candlelight would be used. As time went on, more sophisticated lanterns developed, some even incorporating animation. The zoetrope also provided amusement for those with curiosity towards the moving image. Although there were predecessors going all the way back to an earthenware bowl from Iran, over 5,000 years old, with sequential images painted inside, the zoetrope was definitively invented by William Ensign Lincoln in 1865, when he was about 18 years old, and a sophomore at Brown University. The way it works is by displaying a sequence of drawings or photographs showing progressive phases of that motion. When viewed through small slits on the outside of the cylinder, it looks as though it's moving. Movement, it would seem, was just a sequence of still images. When played fast enough, it could fool the brain into seeing motion. Although it took a friendly bet to motivate a few friends, this very concept was used to discover what the eye could not observe on its own. Using the existing technology of photography and a trick to take a lot of pictures fast, a new industry was about to be created. In 1872, the former governor of California, Leland Stanford, a businessman and racehorse owner, hired Edward Muybridge for a portfolio depicting his mansion and other possessions, including his racehorse, Occident. Stanford also wanted a proper picture of the horse at full speed and was frustrated that the existing depictions and descriptions seemed to be incorrect. The human eye could not fully break down the action at the quick gaits of the trot and gallop of the horse. Up until this time, most artists painted horses at a trot with one foot always on the ground, and at a full gallop with the front legs extended forward and the hind legs extended to the rear and all feet off the ground. Stanford intuitively knew that this was wrong and asked Muybridge to help him prove it. Setting up a system of multiple cameras, Muybridge rigged a sort of tripwire to pull the trigger on the camera each time it ran through, giving multiple images of the horse in various phases of the gallop. It turned out Stanford was right. The horse's feet all left the ground, but they did not take place when the horse's legs were extended to the front and back, as imagined by illustrators of the time, but when its legs were collected beneath its body, as it switched from pulling with the front legs to pushing with the back legs. This technique, known as chronophotography, was originally meant to document things from a scientific perspective, things like the movements of animals and people. Muybridge began displaying his images in motion using a zoopraxiscope, a device he invented and a predecessor to the projector. The zoopraxiscope was named after the zoetrope, that spinning device that would produce moving images. Building on this machine and other similar devices, Thomas Edison and his assistant William Kennedy Dixon developed the kinetoscope and an early projection device that worked like a peep show booth, allowing one audience member at a time. Many of the movies presented on the kinetoscope showcased well-known vaudeville acts performing in Edison's Black Maria studio. The kinetoscope quickly became a global sensation, with multiple viewing parlors across major cities. As the novelty of the images wore off and people grew tired of watching ordinary things in motion, waning public interest caused business to slow by the spring of 1895. It was during this time that inventors began advancing technologies towards projection that would eventually overtake Edison's peep box way of doing things. Things would change forever across the globe in France, when two brothers would take the next step, inviting the moving picture into the lives of people everywhere. Louis and Auguste Lumière were born in Besançon, France, to Charles Antoine Lumière and Janine Josephine Costille Lumière. Their parents owned a photography studio, and the brothers would grow up around the photographic image. The family later moved to Lyon, where their father started a factory that produced photographic plates. The business eventually faltered and was in financial trouble. The brothers developed the process to produce the plates through automation, saving the business much-needed time and money. The pair also developed a dry plate process of developing the plates. Although the dry plate process already existed, the brothers greatly improved it, calling it the blue process. This would turn out to be critical in the development of motion pictures, since it allowed for faster exposure times and significantly reduced the need for a darkroom. In the winter of 1894, Antoine Lumière, then in Paris, witnessed an exhibition of Thomas Edison's kinetoscope, which showed short moving films produced by his camera, the kinetograph. Antoine grabbed a sample of film from one of the exhibitions there to show his sons. He thought they could develop a better, cheaper alternative to the kinetoscope and kinetograph. The brothers began experimenting, and by the following year they invented an alternative to Edison's camera. Calling it the cinematograph, it weighed just 11 pounds and could be operated with a simple hand crank, rather than relying on electric power. Louis drew inspiration from the mechanics of a sewing machine and invented a claw mechanism to pull the film through the camera, in contrast to the sprocket system used by Edison. The cinematograph formed the basis of early cinema cameras. Although it recorded and projected at much slower speeds than Edison's kinetoscope, 16 frames per second compared to 48 frames per second, the cinematograph could shoot film, develop it, and project it, making it easier to make films. Filmmakers were no longer confined to the studio. They could take the camera with them. Now that they had the camera system, it needed public attention to be shown in a way that had never been done before. The Lumière brothers were hardly the first to make moving pictures. Thomas Edison's kinetoscope had been in the works for a few years and even inspired their own device. There were some differences though. Edison displayed his films in a kind of peep show booth, where only one person could watch at a time, which limited the number of views per screening. To change things up, the brothers projected their films onto a screen, allowing a room full of people to watch in one sitting. The subject matter also varied from Edison. Edison's films were primarily vaudeville performers, dancing, moving, or even kissing. The Lumières documented real-life situations and people, like a train pulling into a station or a farmer working in the field. Although they weren't the first to hold a public screening, they are often credited for bringing it to the public persona and creating the experience of going to the movies. The brothers presented their first short film in Paris on March 22, 1895, which was simply workers leaving the factory their family owned. Films then were short, usually about 1 minute in length, and soon began to attract larger crowds. The following year, Louis and Auguste opened several theaters in London, Brussels, Belgium, and New York, where they screened more than 40 films, mostly scenes from French daily life. The most famous featured a train rushing towards the audience. The story goes that when the train pushed towards the audience, they gasped out of fear. However, most of the audience would have been somewhat familiar with films and motion picture, and perhaps the gasps were out of astonishment for the clarity of the image or the creativity of the shot. Cinema would go on to transform popular entertainment. But the Lumière brothers soon lost interest in making moving films, as Edison's format soon dominated the fledgling industry over their own. By 1896, the original cinematograph had been supplanted by the Lumière's Model B, which projected films only in the Edison format. The brothers thought that people would soon grow tired of watching people stroll through the streets or children playing in one-minute films. After just a few years in the business, citing that there was no future for cinema, they turned their attention to another area of innovation: color photography. Photography changed everything. It brought moments normally collected in memories to life on a printed medium. Suddenly, you would know what your grandparents looked like when they were young in a realistic fashion that bested even the finest paintings. But these images were without color, living solely based on brightness values. Although color photography had been done before, August and Louis sought to improve it in a meaningful way. They figured out an easy way to capture color in these marvels of black and white moments. Color theory was nothing new in the time of the Lumières. The concept of a three-color system had been around for a while. The method is based on the Young-Helmholtz theory, which states that the human eye sees color using millions of intermingled cone cells of three types on its inner surface. According to the theory, one type of cone is most sensitive to the red spectrum, another is sensitive to the middle or green region, and the third is sensitive to the blue region. The secret ingredient to preserving these colors can be found in almost any household garden: the potato. Grinding potato starch into fine granules, 1/3 would be dyed blue, then green, then red. Then they would be mixed together and spread evenly onto a glass plate. These granules would then be pressed so that no space would remain between the grains and protected with a varnish. Then a second layer made of emulsion would be added. The picture would then be exposed the same way as black and white photography. The tri-colored potato starch would act as a natural filter, separating the red, green, and blue colors. The images would then be combined, superimposed over one another, creating a color image. This process became known as autochrome and would remain in place till the 1930s, producing thousands of autochrome plates from all over the world. The triumph was short-lived, as Kodak and Agfa soon began to produce multi-layer subtractive color films, which became the basis of color photography until the digital revolution. The Lumière brothers thought that there was no future in the cinema. They refused to sell their cameras to other filmmakers, believing that the industry itself was just a fad. They weren't alone in this sentiment. On the other side of the pond in America, Thomas Edison expressed the same belief. To be fair, the films back then were around a minute in length and weren't stories as much as novelties of moving images. If things never progressed past that, it may have faded away in history. Films were seen as cheap tricks where failed theater actors went. But as time went on, the power of the narrative would soon be expressed in the cinematic medium in ways that Edison and Lumière could never have thought possible. Stars were born, legends were told, and history was made as the movies became the great pastime that would inspire artists everywhere. To walk through the history of the last 100 years is to walk through film history and its power of perception, entertainment, and the spirit of an era. Although the cinema was built over decades from more contributors that can be mentioned or even counted, the Lumière brothers are often credited for inventing the pastime we know as going to the movies. Their contribution can't be ignored, and their genius and innovative thinking changed the world of artistic expression for the better. It's a grand sense of irony that their very name, Lumière, means light.